Hey guys, this is Jay Calderon with JAYONBOXING, and we're going to be talking about the apparent/rumored two-fight plan for Canelo Alvarez in 2025. But before we get into it, of course, please like, subscribe, and share. It definitely helps out the channel, and I do greatly appreciate the support. Now, apparently, as has been reported by Ring Magazine, Canelo Alvarez versus Terence Crawford is going to take place in September, presumably for Mexican Independence Day weekend. According to Ring Magazine's official Twitter page, and I quote, Canelo Alvarez versus Terence Crawford will be held at Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas, Nevada. They continue, the Riyadh season event will be the first ever boxing card to be held at the stadium. End quote. Some pretty interesting news there, to say the very least, which we will be getting into. But now, for the rumor part of this equation. According to sources, Canelo Alvarez could be getting ready for the Crawford encounter by facing future Hall of Famer Jake Paul in May. I'll give those that haven't heard these rumors a second now to process this insanity. Okay, good. So now that everyone should be brought up to speed, let's take a look at these potential fights a bit closer, what they mean for Canelo, the sport, my overall thoughts as well, all of that. And of course, drop your thoughts down in the comments as well. Let's get into this. Now, first things first, let's acknowledge, shall we, that this is insane. I mean, like, what the hell is going on with this sport? It's almost a perfect example of what this sport kind of is. You know, on the one hand, you have a fight with Crawford versus Canelo, where you have two of the best fighters in the sport facing off against each other. Are they the same size? Is it a reasonable fight? You know, that's a little bit debatable to say the very least, but you do have a fight pitting two of the best against one another. On the other hand, you have a circus. You have Jake Paul taking on Canelo in what can only be described as a what sort of fight. Like, what are we doing with this? What is this really going to do? And what it really brings to mind in this situation is, how did we get here? You had this kind of weird perfect storm, if you will, for boxing, where there was a bit of a lull in between a lot of the action. Some of the fights weren't being made, and as a result of it, you had a lot of people who, let's just call them non-traditional fighters, like Jake Paul, come in and seize on this opportunity. And with that, you see some of the craziest fights you can see. I mean, did anyone predict Jake Paul would be taking on Mike Tyson and his exposed cheeks on Netflix? Obviously not. So how did we get here? Well, because quite frankly, boxing left such a void for big, meaningful, attractive fights to the casual fan, which, let's not kid ourselves, casual fans are very important. And when you don't make the fights they want, if people are willing to at least make fights that are of some kind of interest, you get people like Jake Paul emerging. You can't really blame the fans. You can't even really blame Jake Paul as much as many of us would like to. The fact of the matter is, if boxing was a sport that took itself seriously and its fans seriously and made the fights we want to see, we wouldn't be in this kind of mess. Yet, here we are with the biggest name in boxing in Canelo Alvarez, fighting a guy who, quite frankly, isn't very good. That's where we are, and it's because of that sort of lack of meaningful fights that we could have been having this whole time. The question then becomes, should fans support these sort of fights, in my opinion? Quite frankly, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for you there. I mean, ultimately, it's your money, it's your time. Those are the two things you're spending here. Do you want to spend money on that fight? I would say you shouldn't. Do you want to spend time on it? Sure, if you can find a way to do it for fairly cheap, why not? It's a spectacle, to say the very least, but let's keep in mind that is all that it is. It is not a meaningful, legitimate fight. It is simply Canelo being paid a lot of money to beat up a dude who was once on the Disney Channel. Let's make no mistakes about it. Still, we also have to point out this, that while Crawford is a substantially more legitimate fighter, of course, that might not necessarily be the greatest fight Canelo could be making at this point in time in his career either, because quite frankly, what do either of these fights do outside of the money for Canelo here? He's beating a substantially smaller guy who seemed to perhaps meet his physical limit at 154 pounds at 168 pounds. And to further cement the fact that Canelo is the substantially bigger guy, I have a feeling that if he does fight Jake, it's probably not at 168, but probably more in the 170 to 180 range, because I don't think Jake Paul can shrink down to 168. So that's how much bigger Canelo is than Crawford. So even when he fights and beats potentially the more legitimate fighter, it's not like it's screaming like this is the crown jewel of Canelo's career or his resume. It's still kinda trash considering the circumstance. And you know, I mentioned the super middleweight division there and all of its titles to some extent. kind of on purpose, because when all of this stuff is happening, when you have Canelo facing Jake Paul, probably not at 168, if that fight does occur, and then him facing someone who is fighting and campaigning currently at 154 pounds, you kind of wonder, how long are the alphabet organizations going to allow Canelo to keep this division handcuffed to him and his either inability or non-desire to face people that are actual super middleweights? Again, I don't have a problem with if he wants to go out on an easy route in terms of his retirement. I don't think it's great for his legacy, but if he wants to do it, fine. But you are locking up an entire division that could potentially be very, very exciting if you got the hell out of the way or face them. You know, one of those two very reasonable options, I would think. Now, of course, whether or not they should take away Canelo's gold, and they should, and whether or not they will are two different things. But it does seem to me that all of this kind of points out many of the flaws in boxing, including that big fights aren't being made routinely enough, and it allows for things like this to happen. And then when they do happen, it freezes up the sport of its more meaningful encounters in a lot of divisions or in a lot of instances, because you're just caught up in this kind of tomfoolery, this kind of craziness, to be quite honest. Now, in terms of all of this, I must say, I, hypocritical as anyone else listening to me right now, of course, I'm going to tune in. I'm going to watch these fights. Why not? It's kind of what I do. It's what I enjoy doing. I'm going to watch. And I'm going to watch, quite frankly, kind of hoping that I see something a little bit maybe, I don't know what you would want to call it, but surprising. Because quite frankly, I don't really love when fighters try to milk the viewing public. You know, ultimately it's my fault, it's anyone else's fault if they buy into this nonsense, but I have to say, when we've wanted other fights from you, perhaps a David Benavidez fight for a Canelo, and you're giving us fights like this, eventually I stop giving you passes, and I just kind of would like to see you get clipped maybe a little bit or get knocked out, because quite frankly, it'd be a little bit funny. And at the end of the day, at the very least, the sport would sort of be rid of you, and it kind of would be your fault, and I don't really have that much sympathy for you at that point. Sorry, just don't. Doesn't mean that it's going to happen, though. Quite frankly, I expect Canelo certainly to be able to handle Jake Paul, and of course, he is the giant favorite against Crawford, but that sort of proves my point here. He is such a big favorite against both of these guys that, quite frankly, it really means that these fights probably shouldn't happen. But in the end, many of us, myself included, I have to admit, are on some level, in some way, shape, or form, going to support these fights, whether it's building buzz, whether it's tuning in. Many of you are going to buy tickets, going to support it, pay-per-view, all that stuff, and so it's going to continue to happen. I guess the silver lining, if you will, is that Crawford gets to go away with a big payday at the very least, and many of you that like to think about the idea of Jake Paul getting knocked completely unconscious probably are in your best position to see something like that happen with this whole professional boxer career thing that he has going. So if you're looking for a silver lining, I suppose it's that. Either way, that's sort of my take on this. Kind of a bit of a ramble here, but of course this has been some news that's been brewing for a little bit, so I wanted to get something out there. And of course, would love to hear all your thoughts on this one down in the comments. Let me know what you think of these fights. Will they happen? Who do you think wins? How insane are they? Scale of 1 to 10, of course. I'm sure I'll be seeing a few 10s down there, but let me know that down in the comments below. And of course, check out the social media up top. Check out JAYONBOXING.com, subscribe, and check out the video here. Until next time.